September 11th, 1940, London. For 4 nights the German bombers had come in after dark, and for 4 nights the city had taken it almost in silence. That night, the silence broke. All across the capital, the heavy guns opened up at once, not aimed at any single aircraft, aimed at the sky itself. A wall of fire thrown up over the rooftops, shell after shell, a sound so loud that people in shelters said the ground shook harder from the guns than from the bombs. The gun at the center of that wall was an awkward, ugly thing. It sat on a mounting that weighed over 9 tons. It took a crew of men and a tractor to move. Soldiers who served the German 88, the most feared gun of the war, looked at the British answer and were not impressed. Too heavy, too tall, too slow to drag anywhere a tank might actually be. They were looking at the gun wrong, because this same forgotten weapon would spend the next 5 years guarding British cities through the worst the Luftwaffe could throw at them. And in the summer of 1944, it would do something no fighter plane and no balloon could match. It would knock Hitler's flying bombs out of the air over the approaches to London, 4 out of every 5, in the span of a single month. This is the story of the QF 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun. The gun Britain almost wished it could use like the 88, and never did. To understand why this gun mattered, you have to understand what Britain was missing in the 1930s. The threat was obvious to anyone paying attention. The next war would come from above. Bombers were getting faster every year, and they were climbing higher, far above the reach of the guns Britain already had. The standard heavy anti-aircraft gun of the day was the old QF 3-inch, a design left over from the First World War. It was reliable. It was also running out of sky. A bomber at 30,000 feet could fly over it and feel almost safe. The British Army knew it needed something new, a gun that could reach higher, hit harder, and throw a heavier shell to a greater height than anything the old 3-inch could manage. In 1934, the job went to Vickers, one of Britain's great arms makers. What Vickers designed was a serious piece of engineering. The gun fired a shell 3.7 inches across, weighing 28 pounds. That shell left the barrel at around 2,600 feet per second, which is roughly 3 times the speed of a rifle bullet. The early models could throw that shell to a ceiling near 30,000 feet. The later marks, with better fuses and more power, could reach as high as 45,000 feet, and in extreme conditions nearly 50,000. Its slant range, the straight line distance it could throw far up into the sky, was about 7.5 miles. In plain terms, almost nothing the Germans flew could climb above it. Production was authorized in April of 1937. The first guns reached the army in January of 1938, replacing that tired old 3-inch as the standard heavy gun of British air defense. And the timing could not have been tighter. In September of 1938, with Europe holding its breath over the Munich crisis, Britain counted just 341 modern heavy anti-aircraft guns to defend the entire country. 341. For every city, every port, every factory worth bombing. By the time war was actually declared, in September of 1939, that number had climbed to 540. Still not enough, not even close to enough, but the factories were running now. By the height of the Battle of Britain in 1940, Britain had around 1,140 heavy guns in place. Across the whole war, by some counts, close to 10,000 of these guns would be built, in Britain and in Australia and Canada too, at a rate of more than 200 a month. That last number is hard to pin down exactly, but the scale of it is the point. Britain bet enormous resources on this single gun. The man who would command them all was a general named Sir Frederick Pyle. From 1939, Pyle led Anti-Aircraft Command, the organization that owned every heavy gun in Britain. Remember that he commanded the guns, not the field army. That detail is going to matter more than anyone expected, because the gun Vickers built was good enough to start an argument that lasted the entire war. Here is the thing the early crews discovered. This gun was powerful. Its shell, its velocity, its reach, all of it put it in the same class as the German 88, and the 88 was already becoming a legend, not just as an anti-aircraft gun, but as a tank killer that could punch a hole through almost any armor on the battlefield. So the question wrote itself. If the Germans could take their big anti-aircraft gun and use it to murder tanks, why couldn't the British do the same with theirs? The answer was sitting right there on the ground, weighing over 9 tons. The German 88 rode on a mounting that crews could drop into action and, in a pinch, swing down to fire straight at a tank rolling toward them. The British 3.7-inch, in its mobile form, weighed in at over 20,000 pounds in action. That is more than 2 tons heavier than the 88. It stood tall, a high silhouette that an enemy gunner could spot from a long way off. Its recoil gear was built for firing up at aircraft, not for the brutal low-angle pounding of anti-tank work. And it took precious minutes to set up. A gun like that is a fortress against airplanes. But push it up to the front line against tanks and it becomes a big, slow, obvious target that takes too long to get ready and too long to move when things go wrong. And then there was Pyle. The gun belonged to Anti-Aircraft Command, whose one job was protecting Britain from the air. Every gun pulled away for tank hunting in the desert was a gun not defending a British city, so the gun stayed pointed at the sky. The frustration boiled over in the desert. In June of 1941, the British launched Operation Battleaxe in North Africa, an attempt to push back German forces. There, British tank crews ran straight into the 88, used exactly the way they feared. Dug in, hidden, waiting. German anti-aircraft guns firing flat across the sand, tearing British tanks apart at ranges where the British guns could not even reply. British officers watched it happen and thought of the powerful gun sitting back home, locked into air defense. The bitterness was real. They had a weapon in the same class, and doctrine, weight, and a turf war kept it from ever becoming a British 88. But while that argument raged, the 3.7-inch was busy doing the job it was actually built for, and it was about to face its hardest test. When the Blitz came in the autumn of 1940, the German bombers came night after night, the Heinkel 111 with its glasshouse nose, the Dornier 17, the thin flying pencil, the Junkers 88, fast and dangerous. They came over London and the industrial cities in waves, and at first the guns struggled to touch them. Hitting an aircraft you cannot see, flying high in the dark, is one of the hardest problems in warfare. The gun could reach the height. The trouble was knowing exactly where to throw the shell. That is where the rest of the system came in. The gun never fought alone. It was the muscle. The brains were a device called a predictor, first the Vickers predictor and later the Kerrison, a mechanical computer that took the target's speed and course and worked out where to aim, so the shell and the bomber would arrive at the same patch of sky at the same instant. Add to that gun-laying radar, the early sets known as GL Mark I and Mark II, which could find a target in cloud or darkness that no human eye could see. Gun, predictor, radar. Together, they were a weapon. Apart, they were 3 clever pieces that could not do much. If you stay with me, this teamwork is the key to everything the gun achieved later. Hold on to it. Now, back to that night, September 11th, 1940. For the first nights of the Blitz, London's guns had been kept quiet, partly for fear of hitting British fighters. The bombers came almost unopposed, and the effect on the people below was crushing. So General Pyle made a decision. He gathered the heavy guns defending the capital, around 264 of them, and ordered them to fire. Not carefully, not at single targets. A deliberate, thunderous barrage thrown straight up into the night. Here is the honest truth about that barrage, the part the legend usually leaves out. It did not knock many bombers down. Hitting aircraft blind, at night, with the tools of 1940, was still close to impossible. But that was never really the point. Londoners heard their own guns fighting back for the first time, and something changed. Morale lifted overnight. People who had felt helpless now felt defended. And the bombers, flying into that storm of bursting steel, climbed higher to avoid it. Higher meant less accurate. The guns had not destroyed the raid. They had blunted it, and they had given a frightened city its courage back. That is the quieter kind of victory. No dramatic kill count, just a wall of fire that made an entire city feel like it could take the next night and the next. For 4 long years, the 3.7-inch did this work. It stood in the parks and on the rooftops and along the coast. It got better as the war went on. Better radar, better fuzzes, faster loading on the newer marks that could throw out 20 to 25 rounds a minute instead of 10. It was never glamorous. It was just always there. And then, in the summer of 1944, the Germans changed the game. In June of 1944, a new sound came over southern England, a harsh, buzzing drone, like a badly tuned motorcycle in the sky. Then the drone would cut out, and in the silence that followed, people learned to count the seconds before the explosion. This was the Vone, a flying bomb, a small pilotless aircraft packed with high explosive, launched in waves from the European coast and aimed at London. The Germans called it a vengeance weapon. To the people underneath, It was the doodle bug, and it was a special kind of terror because it came by day and by night, in any weather, and there was no crew to shoot down, no human to outfight. Just a machine flying straight at the city until its engine stopped. At first, the Vone looked almost impossible to stop with guns. It flew low and fast, cruising at only around 2,000 to 3,000 feet. That was an awkward band of sky, too high for the small light guns to track easily, and low enough that the big heavy guns had to swing fast to follow it. The first results were grim. In the early days, the guns were destroying only about a quarter of the flying bombs that came through their zone. So the British rebuilt their entire defense almost overnight. They pulled the heavy guns out of the cities and moved them down to the coast, into a long line called the Diver Belt, named for the code word for the campaign, Operation Diver. The idea was simple and ruthless. Catch the flying bombs out over the open ground and the sea before they ever reached the houses. Thousands of guns, the 3.7-inch among them, were dragged to the south coast and pointed out at the channel. And this time, they brought a secret weapon with them. Two, really. The first was better radar, the kind that could track the fast little bomb precisely enough to actually hit it. The second was an American invention that changed air defense forever, the proximity fuse. Here is what that fuse did, in plain words. An ordinary shell only explodes if it physically hits something, or if a timer set before firing happens to be right. Against a small, fast-flying bomb, that almost never worked. The proximity fuse put a tiny radio set inside the shell itself. As the shell raced past the target, the radio sensed how close it was and triggered the explosion at exactly the right instant, throwing a cloud of steel right next to the bomb. You no longer had to hit the thing, you only had to get near it. Put it all together. The 3.7-inch gun for reach and power, radar to find and track, the predictor to aim, the proximity fuse to finish the job. Suddenly, the whole system clicked. The results were almost unbelievable. In the space of roughly 1 month, the share of flying bombs the guns destroyed climbed from about a quarter to nearly 4 out of every 5. In the last week of August 1944, the gunners on the coast were knocking down about 74% of everything that came at them. On one extraordinary day, they hit 82%. 82 out of every 100 flying bombs aimed at London, blown apart over the fields and the sea before they could reach a single street. Be clear about what that number means and what it does not. That was not the gun alone. That was the gun and the radar and the predictor and that little American radio fuse all working together. No single piece could have done it. But the gun was the thing that actually reached up and destroyed the bomb, the platform that all the cleverness was bolted to. Across the whole flying bomb campaign, anti-aircraft guns destroyed 1,859 V1s. By the closing weeks, the guns had become the single most effective defense against the doodlebug, outperforming the fighter planes and the balloons that had carried more of the load at the start. The forgotten gun, the one the tank men had grumbled about, had quietly become the thing standing between Hitler's vengeance weapon and the heart of London. So where does that leave the 3.7-inch? It is easy, looking back, to call it a wasted 88, to say the British had a tank killer in their hands and never used it. But that is not quite the truth, and the truth is more interesting. Yes, it could destroy a tank in direct fire. The power was there, but its great weight, its high silhouette, and its recoil gear built for firing upward made it clumsy and exposed at the front line. It was never going to be the gun you dragged into a tank ambush in the desert. The Germans got lucky with the 88's lighter, lower mounting, and with a doctrine that let their gunners fire at anything. The British gun was built for a different war, the war over the cities, and it was kept there by the men who owned it. And in that war, the one it was actually built to fight, it won. It stood through the Blitz, the muscle behind the barrage that gave London its nerve back. It grew up alongside the radar and the predictor and the proximity fuse until the four of them together could pick a flying bomb out of the sky 4 times out of 5. It never got the legend the 88 got. It never got the nickname. It just did its job for 5 years over the rooftops of a country that needed it. Think about that gun again. Over 9 tons of steel, too heavy and too tall to be the tank killer everyone wished it was. The soldiers who first saw it were not wrong about its weight. They were just wrong about where its fight would be. It was never meant for the front line. It was meant for the sky over your home. And there, the forgotten gun was no joke at all. If you want to see the weapon on the other side of this story, the German 88 that the British envied and feared, that breakdown is on screen right now. Go watch it and decide for yourself which gun really won its war.